Hey everyone, welcome to another edition of the LGBT Alliance USA podcast series. I'm Joss and I'm here with Ariane and Elise and our friend Kathleen from the Lesbian Collective. And we're really excited to talk about an event that they have coming up with the Lesbian Collective in just a few weeks. So, Kathleen, I want to hand it over to you and ask you to tell us about this event.
Sure. So we are having an event called Feminists Speak Out on the harms of gender identity to women in BC. We've invited Kathleen Stock from the UK, and we're going to speak as well, along with another BC feminist named Sherry Smiley. And we are going to be speaking about gender identity ideology, generally speaking, and also what's happening right here in BC. We've been following an important case here, which is of a nurse who's been brought to disciplinary hearing for saying things like sex is a biological reality, it matters in healthcare and in other areas, and that it's not possible to change sex, and that lesbians don't have a penis, and things along this line that I think generally most members of LGBT Alliance USA, I think, and certainly Lesbian Collective supports. And actually, we think we need to be able to say these things. Anyway, she's been brought to disciplinary hearing with the risk of losing her license to practice nursing for having said these things, for example, on social media posts, even though she's actually never had a patient complaint and her nursing record is not in any way in question. And they said that right at the top of the hearing. So we did a postcard campaign around this, and this meeting is kind of part of our overall campaign in support of this nurse, because what we notice is that a lot of what's happening to women and to lesbians is actually in the background, like it's very much hidden. This nurse is an example of a case that's come out in the public and actually isn't getting the media attention it should be getting also. So it's also a little bit buried, even though it's much more prominent than other cases. And we want to talk about the harms to women and to lesbians from this ideology that are happening essentially on a daily basis in BC, and also, of course, in lots of other places around the world. That's what the event's about.
I just had a question then
Yeah.
about that case. Was there a very specific law or policy that led to that complaint against the nurse?
That's a really good question. As far as I understand, the grounds that they're bringing the disciplinary hearing on are basically ethical practice in nursing. Essentially, actually, the very first thing that Amy Ham did that brought her to public attention in terms of this, getting a complaint to her licensing body, was to post a billboard that said "I heart J.K. Rowling" and then put a picture on her social media of that. And based on that, members of the public made complaints against her to the nursing licensing body in the province. And that was the kind of the kickoff of this disciplinary hearing. So even at that level, the BC College of Nurses and Midwives clearly thought that that was a breach of ethical practice in nursing.
So she's never actually had a complaint by a patient then?
Correct. Correct. Yeah.
That's really nuts. It was
Yeah.
all kicked off from
Yeah.
a billboard. That is absolutely crazy.
Yeah. 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 And the college did a bunch of digging. The Lesbian Collective has attended most days of the hearing so far, one member or another, or we've had other women in the city who are allies of ours attend, and we've taken notes and kind of followed what's going on. And so we know that the college hired a security firm to go through all of her social media posts and all of her online activity that could be associated to her name, and pull out anything that they thought reflected opposition to what we would call gender identity ideology, and then added that to the case, basically. So it starts with this public campaign about the complaint about the billboard, but then it ends up with kind of all of her social media posts. And she was very active on social media, and also in organizing public events in Vancouver questioning gender identity ideology and its impacts on women, including lesbians, and on children as well. So there was quite a lot of material there for them to find, which is very unfortunate for her. And she's now been in this process. I think it started during the pandemic, actually. I think it might have been 2020 that it all started.
Canada has very similar free speech laws to the US, though, do they not? So wouldn't this be a breach of that?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think essentially with the grounds, they are trying to curb her speech, and they've said that very directly in the hearing, and they believe they have the grounds to do that because in the argument of the College of Nurses and Midwives, her speech potentially violates the rights of trans and gender nonconforming people because it might lead them to fear that in a medical context, like a hospital or a doctor's appointment, that they might not receive equal and adequate care.
I found this so interesting because in addition to this, in Quebec province, there was just an issue of two gay men who were discriminated against by their doctor, and that's nobody's been picking the doctor up on anything regarding that. So I find it even more concerning that the attack is going this far.
Mm-hmm. Yes, we're into the final days of the hearing, March 18th and 19th. As far as I know, anybody can go to the BC College of Nurses and Midwives website, find the listing for the hearing and the link to watch it. You can't interact with it at all, but you could watch it online. It's just the final arguments from Amy's lawyers. So her final presentation of her case, March 18th and 19th. And then our event's going to be March 21st. And we're going to talk about this case as well as other things that have happened to women in BC and kind of the overall impact of this ideology on women and on lesbians.
Would you say that the situation in BC is worse than the situation in Canada as a whole?
Yeah, that's hard to say. I think, maybe, I don't know, maybe you heard about recent announcements in Alberta, for example, where the premier of that province, which is just right next door to us, has brought in new measures to try to ensure that children are not being transitioned without their parents' knowledge, and especially below a certain age. So there's certain age limitations in terms of when parents have to be notified of name changes and pronoun changes and that kind of thing, as well as around administration of different medical interventions. And it's interesting when that came out, a lot of the reaction, I would say, like in the press as a whole in Canada, was that this is very discriminatory, whereas I would see a lot of the changes that premier is proposing as being very supportive of children, actually, of the well-being of children, and protective of children who might otherwise grow up to be gay and lesbian, or just grow out of feelings of discomfort or dysphoria, or otherwise have other have potential for other kinds of interventions that wouldn't be so disruptive. So, BC is definitely kind of on the train of those who would think that sort of policy or law that Alberta is proposing is deeply discriminatory. I would say overall, that's kind of the idea here, but I don't know if that's really worse than all of Canada. I think it's more that this ideology has really become part of the standard operating procedures, and in some places in Canada it's being questioned in some ways, and in BC it really isn't currently being questioned. And we do effectively have a gender self-ID policy here, so that it requires essentially there's no gatekeeping essentially around changing of gender and on legal documents and all that kind of thing here.
Gatekeeping is not a bad thing. I feel the need to say that. Just how pervasive is the use of self-ID in BC right now?
That, you know, it's really hard to say. I think one of the issues that we are facing in Canada, and I know this is true in the US too, but because all these policies and laws were brought in across the board, essentially at every level of government, as if they pose no concern, as if they were completely neutral or positive in terms of almost like this idea of extending gay rights or extending rights to a new group of people. And the consideration of maybe this is actually impinging on the rights of some other groups of people was not really in the picture at all. And as a consequence, I don't think we're really gathering all that much data about what's going on. So we don't actually know that much information about how many, you know, applications to vital statistics there are. A lot of women's spaces or lesbian spaces have already kind of ceased to exist. Especially lesbian spaces don't exist at all in the province anymore, or only really privately. So it's really hard to know what's happening kind of on the macro scale. And that's part of the reason we want to have this event, is because we have heard all these like individual stories of what's happening to individual women, you know, being challenged at their jobs, being deplatformed. And we also know that there are, for example, men and women's prisons in BC, and that there's been a big change in the school curriculum in BC. But kind of there's no body or no group of people who are adding up all of those things and saying, what's the total impact here? And so this meeting is really a way to kind of say, here's everything we do actually know. And actually, there's a lot that we still don't know because authorities aren't taking this seriously. And we need to build the resistance to this ideology in order to force them to really tell us what's happening, especially for women and girls, and especially for lesbians. Yeah,
That's really important, because until that occurs, right, people that support this can just brush off all of these incidences of overstepping the rights of others as one-off, the exception, when we know that's not the case.
Yeah.
Was Vancouver or BC the place that had the rape crisis center that was closed?
Yeah.
Forced to admit males?
Neither of those things happened in the end, but that's a really, yes,
Okay.
It's probably one of I think it is the earliest case of trans-identified male trying to enter a women's group on the basis that he perceived himself to be a woman, and came essentially to become a peer counselor at Vancouver Rape Relief and Women's Shelter. So went to the training for peer counselors in the Rape Crisis Center and Transition House, and was very politely asked to leave, and then consequently filed a human rights complaint on the basis that he had been discriminated against for not being admitted to the training group. And that human rights complaint was won at that level, and then was challenged at 2 other levels of court in BC, and the Rape Crisis Center won. So won the appeal of the human rights decision, and then won again when that victory was appealed. So the Rape Crisis Center did not have to admit men, still has not admitted men, and has not closed. Vancouver Rape Relief and Women's Shelter is still very much up and running and alive and kicking and all of that. But that's, you know, maybe also partly why BC has, you know, doesn't have a very active and visible movement. That case took 12 years to win, ultimately, cost thousands and thousands of dollars in legal fees, and was accompanied by a lot of, you know, punishment, in the sense that the organization was kind of ostracized and treated as if they were doing something that was bigoted or contrary to human rights, when in fact they're a feminist organization that's defending women against violence against women. So really, they were kind of painted into a corner, no matter kind of what they did or said, and no matter the fact that they had been in existence for decades at the time that this first all happened, and they've done tons of good work on behalf of women and girls, and they continue to faithfully carry out their mission. and feminists are not known to be terrible bigots in the world, this was still kind of the general idea, and it still is to this day. So I think for a lot of women here, they kind of see that example and they see what could happen if they speak up, and maybe don't want to take the risk. And I think, you know, the case of Amy Ham is another example of what could happen to you if you speak up. But us in the Vancouver Lesbian Collective, we just don't want to be silent. We don't want to kind of hope that this all goes away. We do want to speak up, and we also want to support those women that have already stood up and fought and kind of taken those risks. And so we see ourselves as kind of, you know, wanting to join in that fight and wanting to support those women and any other women who wants to stand up for the rights of women and girls, and particularly lesbians. So that's another reason to hold this event. Yeah. We formed in 2015, it's quite a while ago now, but really because we saw that there were no lesbian spaces in the city anymore, and that if there were any kind of like lesbian spaces, they were actually queer spaces. And you know, we started to see this kind of like no TERFs allowed kind of stickers at the door and things, like, you know, as if anyway. So we wanted to start creating some lesbian spaces that wouldn't be totally private, that would have like, we would be protective in the sense that we wouldn't necessarily be like totally out there in the public, like saying exactly what we thought, because we weren't sure at that time how to kind of move and what we wanted to do, but start to create some lesbian community again in order to try to build a bit more towards a more visible resistance. And then just like various things in life happened, including the pandemic, which you know, has kind of put a damper on various activities. But we did really for several years try to intervene at the Dyke March, which kind of became a march like for everyone, so that instead of being by and for lesbians, it was kind of, you know, but yeah, just anybody really. We would go to the Dyke March and we would like try to like dress up in costumes. One year we handed out vagina cupcakes. We brought like our signs with our feminist sheroes, our lesbian feminist sheroes on them. So like, you know, just lesbians who've done cool things in the world that we feel proud of, and that we want to like express our lesbian pride by expressing how awesome lesbians are, including that, you know, these women are examples. And we just got a lot of cold shoulder. And then in 2018, when like London Pride happened and Get the L Out, and San Francisco, I think that year there was like some kind of anti-lesbian, anti-feminist standoff at Pride, I think. When we went to the Dyke March that year, we had a kind of bigger than normal group. We were about 40, and we literally got yelled out of the march, like surrounded and just harassed until we were kind of pushed off to the side by, unfortunately, mostly women, and probably many lesbians among them. And of course, also some trans-identified males. And so we haven't, you know, we obviously did not succeed in changing anybody's mind at the Dyke March, or at least amongst the organizers of the Dyke March. And we don't kind of see that there's an avenue in Vancouver Pride or the Dyke March or anything where we can kind of make inroads. We have to look outside of the traditional LGBT community to try to make our case and stand up for the rights of lesbians. Yeah.
It sounds like then this event in March is very much needed. Tell us more about about the lineup, because it sounded like it was a really great lineup that you have.
Yeah. So so we invited Kathleen Stock from the UK. I'm sure everybody knows who she is. She was also a witness in the Amy Ham case, so it makes it kind of doubly relevant because she's, you know, as you probably all know, she's excellent at just kind of clarifying all these concepts and kind of making very clear sort of what's at stake here in terms of this ideology, and in particular for women and for lesbians. but also she, she was a witness for Amy Hamm, so she can speak to, and hopefully she will speak to that side of things, what she saw in that case. We weren't able to see all the evidence, for example, because we're not party to the proceedings. We only just watched what happened on screen. And also we have Sherry Smiley, who is a local Indigenous feminist. She's from BC, and she has really focused a lot of her research on what's happening to Indigenous women in BC, but also across Canada. And in particular, you may have heard there was an inquiry into the disproportionate numbers of Indigenous women and girls who have gone missing or who have been murdered. And while this was a campaign for many, many years of the Native Women's Association of Canada to get this inquiry, once it was launched, there was just this constant request that it not really be about women. And in the end, this kind of two-spirit, queer, trans focus kind of entered into it and became a really significant part of the inquiry, which was supposed to be about what's happening to women and girls. And so she's, amongst other things, written and spoken about that, and she'll speak about that, I believe, at the March 21st event. I'll also be speaking, and I'll be talking about what our group has done and what we see on the ground in terms of what's happening with gender identity in BC women, as well as what we see in the Amy Hamm case and what we're kind of trying to build towards here in BC. And so that's the event in a nutshell.
It sounds like a great event. And people can find tickets. They can reserve tickets on the website.
Yes, and our tickets are there right on the homepage. So you can find tickets there. And if anybody has trouble, like you can't afford the ticket, just send us a little email and we'll help you out. And other than that, March 21st, 7 p.m. Venue isn't announced yet, just for security reasons, but it's going to be in Burnaby, BC. And there's good transit, lots of parking, and it's going to be a really great event. So yeah, come on out.
Awesome. Thank you so much for taking the time for this event, for this conversation, and I'm really excited. I hope we have a really great turnout.
Yeah, thanks. Ticket sales have been great so far, so yeah, I think it's going to be awesome.
Fantastic.
Yeah.
All
Thank you
right.
so much for your time.
Oh, thank you. Thank you. All right, so we'll catch you on the next one, everybody. Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you.